get my 6. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid and whatever in the world this channel's about. Today, it's a pretty creepy story about farm ponds of all things. First, I'm going to show you what I've been up to this afternoon. See this stick? Look what I made from the top of it. It's supposed to be a mushrooms. First one I've ever made with my little carving knives. Showed it to my wife. It's hers. She always gets the first of everything. Like I said on a live stream the other night. She laughed. She thought it was funny for some reason, but whatever. Bless her heart. That's why we call her Giggly Girl, right? Everything's funny. I'm gonna sit up here and work on my next mushroom. And as I do, I'm just gonna tell you this story about farm ponds. It's funny. I have a funny joke, or not a joke, but a funny short story about farm ponds. When I was a kid growing up in Appalachia, I was an avid fisherman. I still enjoy fishing, as you know. We make some fishing videos on our show every now and then, but I don't do it as much as I did when I was a kid. I was obsessed with it, and I always wanted to catch the big one, no matter what the species. Big trout, big bass, big catfish, just fish. I wanted to catch the biggest fish. So I got the idea one time. I thought I need to find out where all the state records were caught, because of course they didn't have the internet back then. It was in like a pamphlet or a book. You can find all this information out online now. And my way of thinking was, well, if I can just figure out where the big ones were caught, the biggest were caught, there's got to be another big one in there. So I was looking through, and it would say like the largest brown trout was caught in such and so river, but then the largest catfish was caught in. It would list the county, and then it would say farm pond. And then the biggest, state record bluegill was caught in such and so county at farm pond. And I was like, man, I got to find out where this farm pond place is. So I went to my, one of my childhood best friends, who's one of my fishing buddies. I said, dude, I know where we can catch some massive record-sized fish. He's like, where? I said, farm pond. He goes, what? And I told him, and I showed him the book, and he goes, you idiot. That means that was caught out of a pond on somebody's farm. And, well, that's a true story. And I thought, man, that's cheating. We got a pond here on our place, and it's got bluegill in there like this. I mean, it's kind of like cheating. All you have to do is wait for them to get big enough and catch them. So anyway, that was my introduction to farm ponds, until I moved to the great state of Virginia, and they're everywhere. In Appalachia, up in the mountains, there just was no farming. There was coal mining and timbering. So there were like mine runoff ponds and stuff everywhere. But these farm ponds came to Virginia, and I noticed, and any of you who know anything about country living or farming knows that the reason for those ponds, well, they serve twofold. Number one, watering holes and a cooling off spot for cattle, especially in the summers. Cattle originated in Eurasia. It's a much colder climate than Virginia, especially if you go further south from here. It's just too hot for a lot of cows, and so it was important to have those farm ponds for them to cool off in. And then, of course, fish. A lot of times people, when they build a pond, they'd go get fish from somewhere. I mean, they call stock trucks now, but back in the day, and this is how we did ours, we'd catch them somewhere in the river or the lake and bring them home in the cooler and put them in the pond. That's how we stocked our pond with catfish and bass. The bluegill were already in there. But oddly, and this is where I'm getting to the story here I'm going to share with you, which is a story that was shared with me yesterday from somebody that this happened to. I've noticed there are a lot of farm ponds on properties that really are not active farms, never have been, or places where they don't raise cattle and never have, but yet they're still ponds. And at first I just wrote this off as, well, that's just for the aesthetic purposes. Everybody wants to have a beautiful pond on their property, right? Forests, fields, streams, ponds, whatever. But I've always had this thought in the back of my mind, there's got to be more to it than this. And the story I'm going to tell you I think will reveal a lot of that more to itness of it ish. So we're at a social event a couple days ago, and we're hanging out with some old friends, seeing some similar, or familiar acquaintances, and met a few new people. And I met a very interesting guy, probably about 10 years older than me, who is new to this area for now. I guess the kind of work that he and his wife do, they move every few years or so. But he's in a unique situation for most people, not for most people in this area where I live, but for most people around the world, in that he comes from a long line of generational wealth. So he's going on and on about all these different places he owns. It's like he doesn't just buy a house if he's there for 2 or 3 years and then sell it and go somewhere. He keeps these properties, and like, we're talking hundreds of acres, and a couple places thousands of acres. And I'm just listening to him, and of course I can't relate. I have no clue what that's like. Until I bought this place, the only ground I ever owned was the dirt underneath my fingernails. So he mentions that he had X amount of like acreage over in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, and how that's been in the family. Actually, that's not a property he's bought because of his job moving around. That's been in the property for a couple centuries. And that, it's one of these Virginia First families, or First Virginia families. And a lot of folks in that category don't like the explanation of what that means or what that is. But basically, they're folks whose ancestors owned large plantations and many, many, many slaves, enslaved people. So a lot of history goes back a long time. But I knew where this place was because I've actually been over there. Knew where a lot of the places he was going on and on about. I got this, I got that. Knew where a lot of the places were. And he wasn't coming across as like an arrogant, snobbish, pretentious. He was very enjoyable to talk to. He was just small talking about his life, and different people have different experiences, come from different backgrounds, and he was just sharing his. And I would share some of mine, and he never looked down his nose at me a bit. He never called me a dumb hillbilly from West Virginia. He enjoyed my stories as well, so I actually enjoyed talking to the guy. Look forward to seeing him again sometime. But he was telling me about this place over in the Shenandoah Valley, and I said, yeah, I've been over that way. That is absolutely beautiful. And he mentioned there were multiple households of his family, cousins, aunts, uncles, several generations that reside on the property now. This is like a couple thousand acres big property. And I asked him how often he goes over there. He says, I never go over there. He says, I spent most of one summer there when I was about, our kids' age, 11-year-old, going on 12. He said, and just some strange things happened that didn't sit well with me, and I kind of heard some wild stories about what had gone on that summer. A few months later, around Halloween, actually, as a matter of fact, shortly thereafter, and he just decided he's never going back. Now, he's driven through there, and he's stopped off and said hi to some folks during the day when he's been passing through that area, but he hasn't spent one night on that land since. And I said, well, you've piqued my curiosity to a pretty great degree right now. By the way, this is how you do these mushrooms. If anybody's interested, you make like a cut line, and you just carve down into it from both sides. Start rounding off the top to make the head of the shroom. See, it's not hard, just time consuming. Takes some time, but hey, why not just sit in the woods and tell a spooky ghost tale while you do it, right? So then I'll round this off and burrow down through here, and I'll use my bandsaw to cut the end off like that, so I get a nice clean cut. I gave this one to Dearly. She'll set that on her desk and laugh at it. She laughs at everything I make, but that just means it makes her happy, right? When people laugh, they're happy. So he was about 11 or 12 years old, and he'd gone down there to stay for the summer. And he tells me, well, because after I told him you piqued my curiosity, I want to know what happened. And he goes, oh, you'd never believe me. It's one of those stories that I usually don't tell until after I've had a few drinks, and I made sure that my audience has had quite a few drinks. It's good for a campfire. And he by this time he had never asked me the kind of work I did or anything. So I told him, I said, dude, I'd love to hear your story, because I'm a storyteller. And I mentioned, yeah, I write books, but I do it orally as well. I mentioned, being a YouTuber. Didn't tell him the channel, but he's like, well, I'll tell you, you're going to think I'm crazy. And I'm like, hey, everybody thinks I am, so we'll be two peas in a pod. So here's the story. He goes there, 11 or 12 years old, and his very first morning, after he had arrived the day before, spent his first night there, he said the first morning he's awakened at like 11, it was late in the morning, by the sound of shotgun fire, like just 3 coming from like a 12 gauge pump. Like that. Well, he wasn't startled, he wasn't scared, and he wasn't surprised. It was summer, so it wasn't hunting season, but it was rural Virginia. And again, this was probably 40 years ago. And people hunt, they have guns, they shoot. If it's not hunting season, they might target practice, but small game, you can hunt small game on your property in Virginia, as long as you do it safely, year round. You don't have to have a license, and doesn't even have to be in season. So like right now, even though it's June, you can hunt squirrels, you can hunt rabbits. So he figured maybe that's what was going on. Somebody's just out there with a shotgun, was shooting small game. Well, he gets up, he leaves the guest room he was staying in, he goes in the living room, and he notices that his aunt and his uncle and all of his cousins were like looking out the front window. Well, he thought that was a little odd, because since the sound of gunshot is so common out in the country in rural Virginia, why would they be concerned for any reason? So his uncle sees him, and he just starts explaining that the guy doing the shooting was the guy from across the road. And here's what was odd about it. Now, the property across the road where the guy doing the shooting was coming from had at one point been part of the family property, but had been sold off sometime before this and no longer was. I don't know how many acres that tract was or not, but he said the guy that lived there, well, he called him a hippie. That's just what he said. And he said as his uncle explained it to him, he loved nature, he loved animals, he loved wildlife. He didn't hunt, didn't fish, and he wouldn't let anybody on his land to do either, because he loved all life, except it appears human life. He didn't think much of people, hated people. He was antisocial. Well, the guy's aunt and uncle were at least on speaking terms with him. Like, if they saw him, they would smile and wave. He would smile and wave back, but there was never any sort of lengthy conversations. They were just cordial at best. But they were concerned about the guy because they knew he didn't hunt. And why would he be over there shooting? So about that time, they happened to see the guy come out from around the side of his house, and sure enough, he was, carrying a pump shotgun with him when he came around. So the guy's uncle decided he's just going to go make sure everything was okay. So he goes out and starts talking to the guy. And, this guy I'm talking to yesterday says here he is. He's a little kid watching through the window, watching his uncle talk to that guy. Now, what I left out and haven't told you so far that I'm going to tell you now is that there was a farm pond behind this guy's house. The guy doing the shooting, even though, and once upon a time, I guess they ran cattle over there or whatnot. But during this particular summer, it was one of the worst droughts in Virginia state history. It hadn't rained for months. It's like it'd been a dry winter, pretty dry winter. Hadn't rained much to speak of, any to speak of during the spring, and it hadn't rained all summer. And everything was dry. The creeks were dry, the small rivers were dry, and the farm ponds all over that part of the state, at least, were drying up as well. So the uncle comes back and to relay the information he got, and he said, I think the guy across the road is going crazy. And he said, why? He said, well, he told him the guy was in his house. The guy who was doing the shooting had been in his house, and he had a zero tolerance policy for trespassers, especially if they were poaching, because he loved all life so much. He didn't want anybody hunting it, except, of course, human life. He'd shoot you if you came on there to kill a squirrel. Nice pacifist that he was. So anyway, he said the guy looked out his window and saw a man stumbling to get out of the pond that was back there that was pretty much dry. There might have been a few puddles of water in it. And he had 2 chickens. He had a chicken under each arm, all muddy, kept falling down in the mud, and the chickens kept trying to flop and get away. But man, he was holding on to them chickens. Them chickens weren't getting away. So the guy went out there, and he said he didn't shoot at him. He's all about giving everybody fair warning at least once. So he gave him 3, I guess. Just shot 3 rapid shots consecutively, and then when he lowered the shotgun, there was some smoke, and he's looking around for the guy. Where'd the guy go? Well, he couldn't see him, and so at first he thought, oh no, maybe I actually hit the guy. So he walked over to the edge of the pond and he looked in, and the guy's uncle confirmed this, because when the hippie across the road told him this story, he went with him to look in the pond. And he said you could clearly see footprints where somebody had been getting sucked up in the mud, sinking down into the mud to like knee level, trying to get out. He said there were some chicken feathers, but there were some couple of very odd things going on here. Number one, the old hippie guy, he didn't have chickens. He didn't raise chickens. So this guy got these chickens from somewhere else. And number two, the tracks and all the activity that you could see that had been going on in the pond seemed to originate in the center of the pond. It's as if this guy was in the pond somehow, as if he had fallen out of the sky into the center of the pond with 2 chickens underneath his arms, and he was struggling to get out. And thirdly, I guess, they had no clue where he went. He was nowhere to be seen. And the tracks just kind of stopped. They came out, you could see he got out of the pond, and then they just kind of end. There was some mud on the grass, some chicken feathers, and then there's nothing. So that seemed very odd, very, very odd indeed. So another week, 10 days or so went by. Nobody thought much about it, about anything, until 10 days, maybe 2 weeks later, this guy gets wakened up in the middle of the night to the sound of gunfire. But it's coming from one of his relatives' houses, probably half mile down the road, and it was a high-powered rifle, so therefore the sound would carry that far, especially at night, in the dead of night. No artificial noise out here in the country. So the next day, early the next day, and he found this out at lunchtime. He was a 12-year-old kid. He was sleeping into almost noon every day. But his uncle that he was staying with relayed this story to him. At first light that next day, his uncle went down to the home of his cousin or whatever who had been doing the shoot the night before. And once again, he got an amazing tale. The guy said he heard like chains rattling and like bells, like a cowbell or a dinner bell. And it woke him up, and he was looking outside, and it was a full moon, no clouds. And I'm telling you, I can come out here at night on my place and walk around without a flashlight on nights like that any time of the year. And he said he saw what looked like 3 or 4 guys messing around down there in the farm pond. And it appeared as if a couple of them had bells strapped to their necks. So he grabs his high-power rifle, and he goes out there, and he says, I don't know who you are, and I don't know why you're here, but you're in the wrong place. You need to get on out here. And that's like Southern American or Appalachian American for get on out of here. But that's how you say it. You got to say, get on out here. Trust me. Locals will know what you mean. So he fires 3 rounds into the air. So like a .243 high-powered rifle. All of a sudden, same thing. These guys he saw, he thought they were planning on robbing his barn or something, because they came in numbers, 3 or 4 of them. Well, he goes down to the pond looking for him, doesn't see him. When his cousin the uncle of the guy telling me the story showed up the next morning. They went down there to look around together. They checked the barn to see if anything had been stolen. Nothing had been stolen. Went down to the pond. Darndest thing happened again. You could look into the pond, which had maybe that much water in it because of the drought. You could clearly see where several people had struggled to get out of the pond, but there was no indication that they had ever gone into the pond. It's as if they had dropped out of the sky into the middle of the pond, struggled to make their way out, and they would have done this completely unseen and unheard if the guy hadn't heard what sounded like cowbells. That's what woke him up. That's why he saw this. And no one was to be seen anywhere around. A couple more weeks go by, and same thing, gunshots come in the middle of the night from one of the farmhouses on the property, a little bit further up in the other direction, yada yada. To keep it short and simple, the uncle that the guy telling me the story was staying with went up there to check that place the next day, and I guess the guy's cousin lived there. He thought he was one of his horses were being stolen. These people had several horses, and he just happened to be up late at night, later than he should have been, and looks out and he sees in the pond what appears to be somebody on horseback struggling to get out of that pond while on horseback. And so he just assumed somebody had indeed stolen one of his horses and was trying to make off with it, so he did shoot to kill. He aimed for the perpetrator, but there was no body left after the shooting was over. The guy and the horse was gone. The next day, along with the storyteller's uncle, go down there. It's as if a horse had dropped out of the sky into the center of the pond. You could see where it struggled to make its way out of that pond, but there was no one to be seen, and the tracks ended right there on the grass, just at the edge of the pond. And the guy wasn't missing any horses. All of his horses were accounted for. There was not a single horse stolen. And then that was the last time anything like this happened while this gentleman I spoke with yesterday was there, and he went on back to where he was growing up elsewhere at the time. I'm not going to say where. I don't want to give too much of this guy's personal information away. But he said it was later in the year, in November, just before Thanksgiving, that because he went home and he told his mom and dad, who had gone off to the south of France or something for the summer, they didn't want him with them, so they dumped him off down here with some family in Virginia. And they didn't believe him when he'd gone home, and they asked him, tell us all about your summer in Virginia. And he told them about these things, and they thought he was making it up. Well, they got word from their kinfolk down here in Virginia in November that it finally rained. That drought lasted the rest of the summer into the fall, and it finally just poured the rain down on Halloween night. And everybody in the area was happy. They were tickled to death, and people were going out and dancing around in the rain. And multiple families from that property that had farm ponds that had been dried up, completely dried, claimed that on that night, on that Halloween night of all nights, as it's pissing down the rain, they saw ghosts in mass coming up out of those farm ponds, coming out of the ponds as it was raining and drifting off into the fog. And this is the guy's take on it, and I think he's right. Throughout the centuries, there had been people who had been taken out of this world. Chicken thieves, horse thieves, enslaved people who ran away, would try to run away. That whole bell thing, back during the days of slavery, if an enslaved person were to escape, run away, and if they were caught after they were brought back and severely beaten to within an inch of their life, how dare they, human being, thinking they, had a right to not be owned by somebody else. Sickening. Anyway, they would often weld like a metal bar around their necks with like a beam coming off, like a steel pole with a bell on it, and they would keep that there for life. so that if that person ever tried to run away again, I mean, they'd be easy to hear. It was terrible. But here's what's scariest to me about this. When I drive around here and I see all these farm ponds everywhere on properties where there are no cattle, on properties that just aren't actively farmed and probably never were, makes me wonder, why is it that they built that pond? I don't think it was so much about some of these ponds that were built like a century or more ago. I always thought it was for looks or a place to keep your fish, listen to the frogs in the spring, but I'm starting to wonder, like the old movie, and I'm not trying to steal, the line from it, but what lies beneath? I'm going to go down to the house and finish this up so I can pay attention to this, not my storytelling, because came up with 10 fingers, I'd like to keep them. See you for more next time.